Good evening, everyone. According to my watch, it is 6 o'clock, and we're so glad that you're all here. We would like to start on time so that we can all finish on time. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome in this cold, cold evening. And I also just heard that traffic lights are out. So I'm so glad that we have electricity. So praise God for that. And we hope that we continue to have electricity here in this building. Thank you for coming out. And a special welcome to Dan. I'm glad you made it down here. And I would like to start us with prayer. Gracious, loving God, we're in the season of Advent, the season where we focus on hope, love, peace, and joy. And in this Advent season where we prepare ourselves not only for the baby Jesus to be born, but for our hearts to be renewed. Advent season also means preparing, waiting, anxiety, not knowing what the future brings. You have been faithful to us in our congregation for more than 35 years. And now, as we begin a new chapter, we ask your blessings, not only on tonight, but that you lead us as you have faithfully led us through the last more than 3 decades. Some of us were here when this church was built, others not. You have been with us on our journey, and we ask your blessings, especially on Dan tonight, as he is here, the only one not knowing everybody. So that you will fill us all with your presence and guide us with your spirit and bless us with a decision which is right for all of us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Sigrid, and welcome. I'm glad to see so many here this evening. Before we get started, I have 3 commercial announcements, however. The cookie sale is this Saturday, 9 to 11. Come and get your cookies for Christmas. Our Christmas pageant is then Saturday night at 7 p.m. It's an original musical. We have a very talented person in our congregation, Jen Seckler. She writes this stuff just for our youth and our church. It's a really special event. And then Sunday after our 10:30 service will be our annual church meeting. So we invite you to be there. I hope everyone had a chance to get the handouts that were at the back of the room. If not, I think we probably have a few extra. Okay? We're here tonight to introduce Pastor Dan Doty as our interim pastor. And when we thought of having a special council meeting, we thought, well, let's include anyone in the congregation who would like to come and meet Dan. So thus the wider attendance tonight. Now, I must admit that when I learned that we would have a pastoral vacancy, my first thought was not about undergoing an interim pastoral process. That process is what Dan's going to talk about this evening. It's a process that is so important to our congregation and our denomination that the denomination requires that a church seeking a pastor go through this interim discerning process before they will advertise a position on the national bulletin board, if you will, for candidates. So it's obviously a very important topic. We're very fortunate that Dan has had that training. He is anxious and willing to lead us through that process. The way this process works, and I'm not stealing any thunder, believe me, the church will go through a process. It's much like long-range planning or a visioning process, determining, where we're headed, how we're going to get there, and the like. Following that process, we will ask a pastor to be our associate pastor. That may be Dan. Dan may find out about us and say, no thanks. On the other hand, it may not be Dan. We may advertise and seek someone else. So that's what this kind of interim pastor does. And without any further information, I think I'll turn it over to Dan before I take too much of your thunder.
Well, good evening, folks. Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Jeff. So I want to talk a little bit about myself and who I am, where I've come from, and then we'll talk a little bit about the interim process along the way. I am from Columbus Grove, Ohio, which is not near Columbus, and it's not near Grove City, okay? You can see that it's up in the northwest corner of the state, near Lima, Ohio, about halfway between Toledo and Dayton, just off 75 to the west of Findlay. That's our town hall there with a mural on the side. It's a town of about 2,500 people, and I think sometimes they have to count the dogs and the cats to come up with that number. We have 2 stoplights in town, one which is probably redundant and is not necessary, but it's a beautiful little town, a community that I grew up in. My dad was one of 8 children. He had 3 sisters and 4 brothers, 2 sets of twin brothers. And most of the brothers and sisters are still living, and most of them still live in Columbus Grove. So it was a wonderful upbringing. I went to the Columbus Grove United Church of Christ. And when you Google, it's a little pixelated, I see, but it's the largest picture I could find of that church. Sadly to say, it's no longer United Church of Christ. It voted to leave several years ago. Not sure of all the circumstances that brought it to that, but it's a beautiful, lovely community church still. My parents still attend there. We have a 60-year tradition of a pancake and sausage supper, so I go in February and I flip pancakes all night, and it's just beautiful to see some of the folks, my Sunday school teachers, as well as folks that I grew up with. Let me flip. So because of that, well, let me say, if I can turn my pages. So that I grew up in the United Church of Christ and going to church camps. So this is a picture from Temple Hills, 1980. Clear up in the top corner, there I am, very top corner. If you look down here, the front row, the girl just 2 in, that's Tamara Kinser. I don't think she's showed up, but she's a member here at Westerville. And right next to her in the very bottom corner here is my brother. We both went to Outpost Camp together. We went for 3 years together. So we had a wonderful experience at camp, and I was a camp director this past year. So I've enjoyed that as a part of my ministry. So growing up in Columbus Grove, that does make me a graduate of Columbus Grove High School. Go Bulldogs. I left there to go to Bowling Green State University. I really wanted to be a band director. Yeah, go Falcons. But I played concert tuba, and I was accepted at the university to both study voice and to study tuba. And we went into the tuba instructor's office, my dad and I, on a visit, and he sat there and proceeded to tell my father that I would have to have my own instrument. It would probably be about $3,500. My father had a small seizure at that point. And we literally walked out of the office, we walked down the hall, and he looked at me. I kid you not, he looked at me and said, "Now your voice is free, right?" So I became a vocalist by default. My first degree, my undergraduate degree, was a bachelor's of music education. So I became a vocal music instructor and taught in Monroeville, Ohio, which from Bowling Green was about an hour and 10-minute drive. My wife did have a job in town, so we didn't move, so I was making an hour and 10-minute drive every day there and back. Taught there for 2 years in Monroeville, and then got a new position, slightly closer to home by about 10 minutes. I taught in Sandusky City Schools up on the lake, and taught there for 2 years. But in that first year of teaching there, I really realized something about myself is that I love to perform music. I love music in general. I don't like teaching music. It's not, the pedagogy of it is not a skill that I necessarily have. In classroom settings, I love teaching Bible, I love teaching history, but the teaching of music is something different for me. I enjoy performing it. And I'd always thought about ministry and about seeking perhaps a position in a church. So my first year at Sandusky, I sort of answered my call to ministry and spent the next year going through the candidacy process. Now, at that time, living in Bowling Green, I was married to a Methodist. I was attending a Methodist church. I was singing in a Methodist church choir. I actually was on scholarship. I was a choral scholar to sing in that. So I got paid to become a Methodist, just putting that out there. But so when I answered my call to ministry, it was in the Methodist context because that's where I was at the time. So I left the state of Ohio. We moved to Illinois, and I went to Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, just north of downtown Chicago. I served a small church there, south of the city. So I went to Columbus Grove, BGSU, and got my Master's of Divinity at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. One final thing I'd like to share, I am a member also of the Order of St. Luke, which is a liturgical and sacramental group that likes to study and practice and do scholarship around the sacraments and around liturgy of the church. Now, that sounds like a bunch of stuffy old guys just sitting around in these ivory towers, but I assure you it's not. It's a fun group. We get together on a monthly basis, and so liturgy and sacraments and the worship of the church are very important to me. So those are the associations and the things that I have done in those years. As I said, I was a vocalist by default. When I was in college, I did get bit with the opera bug, and so I studied opera and went on to perform. The next picture on the right, your left, my right, that's me singing in Italy. I lived in Italy for a summer singing opera. There's a statue behind me of Giacomo Puccini, the opera composer. And what you don't see is the next building over is the home that Puccini lived in. So here I am singing a Puccini song, standing in front of a Puccini statue outside the home that Puccini lived in. Nothing intimidating about that at all. On your right side is me singing in one of the ancient theaters in Turkey. I had a sabbatical in Turkey in the year 2012, and when they found out I was a singer, every one of those ancient cities has a theater, an old theater. Laodicea actually has two. When they found out I could sing, they made me sing in all those ancient theaters. And even though they're crumbling and they're half missing, they're still acoustically very wonderful places. So that was my singing. And then one more. In May of 2017, I had the joy of making my debut at Carnegie Hall. So there I am at the stage door and then singing on the stage at Carnegie Hall, which was a bucket list thing that I checked off that night and enjoyed that. So I'm kind of glad I didn't own a tuba back in the day. Now, I want to dispel a myth or a rumor that I think you've heard, that you all think that I'm a runner. You may have heard that. I am not a runner. I run, but I am not a runner. I hate every step of it. I don't enjoy it. But somewhere, you could see, I was a little bit heavier at one point. In fact, at my highest, I was 365 pounds. Was diagnosed as diabetic, type 2 diabetic, and I take a pill for that. But for those of you that know the numbers, the A1C number was over 7 at that point. My last reading was 5.9. So through diet and exercise, it's come down. And the exercise is the running piece. So I do a 5K 6 times a week in the morning. And so my pace, that was one of my better paces. I just wanted to share that. That's my neighborhood that I run in. So that's my 5K in the morning. I don't want you to get all excited that I'm a runner and we're going to have all these running clubs. And so, it came home to me in 2018, the week between Christmas and New Year's. My wife and I got to chaperone our daughter's high school band trip to Disney. And so I found a picture from the last time we were in Disney in 2006. So there on the left is 2006 and then 2018. So that's why I run, so I can actually eat food. I have served 4 churches in my time as a minister. I started at the top left-hand corner over there, the Ashcombe United Methodist Church, a lovely place, lovely people. I still hold many of them as dear friends. But about 35 in attendance on a Sunday morning. It was in south of Kankakee, Illinois. A wonderful community of folk. I served there for 6 years, and at 5 years, in their 150-year history, I was the longest-serving pastor they ever had. You know Methodists, they move every 3 to 5, 5 to 7 years. So at 6 years, I still am the longest-serving pastor they ever had at the Ashcombe United Methodist Church. The top right-hand corner, Community United Methodist Church in Union City, Ohio. We lived on the state line. The parsonage of that church was on the state line. We pulled out of the driveway and we were in Indiana. Not only were we in Indiana, we were an hour behind. That was when my wife was on faculty at Ball State University in Muncie, and we were just 1 hour directly to the east of Muncie, Indiana. So going to Muncie in the morning was great because you left at 8 o'clock and you got there at 8 o'clock. But at night, when you left there at 3, you got home at 5. That wasn't so good. I served there 2 years, and I took a leave of absence from ministry, active ministry. At that point, there was, I came back to Ohio, and I'd served all my time in Illinois, and the bishop, the district superintendent, nobody knew who I was. It was a very blind appointment at the very last minute, and they were looking for something else in a pastor, and I perhaps was looking for something else different in a church. So I took a leave of absence, went back to my first profession, which was teaching, and I got a teaching job in Barberton, Ohio, which is right to the southwest of Akron. And so we moved to Wadsworth, and I taught at Barberton City Schools. Realized that ministry was my life, ministry was who I am and what I'm called to be. So I went. My daughter was having a sleepover, and one of the mothers and I were sitting in my downstairs hall talking, and she said, "Well, you know, Trinity United Church of Christ, they need a pastor." I never thought about perhaps I could serve in my old denomination and not be moved by the bishop every 5 years. So I went in and visited that congregation that next Sunday, and I went and met the pastor. I said, "How do you think I could get my ordination in the Methodist Church moved to the UCC?" So she sent me to the association. We began talks, and a year later I was called to serve at Trinity United Church of Christ in Wadsworth, and I served there for a little over 11 years as their senior minister. The opportunity to serve on in a larger setting with a larger staff, a multi-clergy staff, came open at the Bath Church, was about 20 minutes of commute from my house. We were not interested in moving before our daughter, our youngest, was out of high school. So it presented a time for me to do a new challenging thing, a new setting for ministry, a larger program church, working with multiple clergy. And so in November 2016, I was called to be the senior minister of the Bath Church in Akron, Ohio. And I served there for 3 years. So we'll talk about the 400-pound gorilla in the room. Why did I leave the Bath Church? Bath Church is a wonderful place. There's wonderful people, and they're very dear to me, and I perceived I was very dear to them. But in a nutshell, the Bath Church did not go through the interim process. They went from senior minister to senior minister. The last pastor before me preached the first Sunday of October, left, and then I preached the first Sunday in November and took right off. There was a thought in the association at the time that larger churches, more stable congregations, could perhaps go from senior minister to senior minister without much disruption. There's another colleague I have up in Lakewood. It's the same thing happened to him. We both have the same struggles. This is a model that does not work. There was no breathing room for that congregation to consider what the next phase of their ministry could be. Since they went from senior minister to senior minister, they just thought everything was going to happen exactly the same way. And different styles, different preaching, different teaching. No matter what, I was going to be different because I wasn't the former pastor who had been there for 25 years. Beloved, 25-year ministry. He and I were great colleagues, good friends, never had a problem with the previous minister. But the church was just not ready to open themselves up to their next pastor. Part of the interim process we'll talk about in a little while is looking at your history and seeing who you were. But it really is that time, that space, that pause to breathe, to grieve the leaving of a former senior minister and prepare yourself for new opportunities when you come into a new situation with a new pastor to serve you. Because no matter what happens, that person's going to be different, and that person's going to take some time to get to know, and their style and the way they do things. So it just became apparent to both of us on both sides that after 3 years, it wasn't a match that was fulfilling either myself or the church. We mutually decided to part company very amicably. As I say, they're wonderful people. I still hold them dearly. I pray for them. They do have an interim minister right now, and I'm very excited for them to do the interim process, which is a very important piece, as Jeff was saying, and we'll share more about that and why that is. But that's why I left the Baptist Church, and I'm happy to talk to anybody any more about that you'd like to. So those are the churches I served. Let me introduce my family. My wife and I have been married for 32 years. We have 3 children. Our oldest daughter here on the right is Christian. I just had lunch with her today. She is a CPA. This summer she turned 30, and she owns her own home in Akron, Ohio. And she was working near where she bought her house, and then all of a sudden got recruited away and now works for a company in Wadsworth. So I get to call her up every once in a while and say, hey, let's go have lunch, because she's in town. But for that company in Wadsworth, she's also a controller of one of their divisions, one of their companies in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So she does spend a week per month up there helping them with their month-ending reports. My wife, Amy, also is a graduate of Bowling Green State University. She has a degree in music education and elementary education. She's taught in the public school systems for many years. While I was doing my Master's of Divinity, from Ashcombe, I would commute 2 hours up to the seminary. She would commute an hour south to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she was working on her PhD in music education, curriculum, and instruction. She's ABD, all but dissertation. She never finished that. Because when we moved away from the university, she took a job at Ball State. But when we got back to Ohio, she taught in the public school system. She taught music. The first year we moved to Ohio, we bought our house, but the first house we ever bought. Made our first payment in January on the house. February, we both got laid off by our school systems. So she eventually got called back to her school, but they didn't have a music position for her, but they had a special ed position. And though she wasn't certified, they worked with the state to make sure she could do that, take some classes, but that was only a 1-year position as well. So the next year she got let go again, got hired back the next year by the same school system, and taught 5th grade for maybe 12 years. Loved it, loved 5th grade. She went back to school and got her principal's license, and she now is an administrator at her school. She is the technology integration specialist, so she helps teachers with technology in the district. Our son Sean is the athlete. If anybody's he's not even a runner, but he's the athlete of the family. He was a high school track athlete. He was a pole vaulter. And that's, knowing my son, I always think pole vaulters, you have to be a little bit off, because if you really think about what you have to do. Went to many pole vault meets. He qualified for the state meet here in Columbus. Went off to college and was a collegiate pole vaulter at Ashland University. Worked his way all the way up to 15th in the nation at one point. Proud papa moment. Sorry. He now works for a company in Akron called Track Athletics, and so he's a coach and the director of athletics for them. So he does individual and personalized trainings, and he does sales for the company and helps them promote their business. The owners of the business, the husband and wife, the wife will spend this next summer her 4th time as an Olympian. She's a pitcher on our American softball team. Wonderful couple. Our daughter Katie is 17. She is a senior in high school, Wadsworth High School. She was the drum major of the high school band the last 2 years. She plays oboe, and she is playing in about a half hour in the winter band concert at Wadsworth High School tonight. My wife is videotaping it and will send it to me. She also runs sound for all the performances, the musicals, the plays, the school board meetings. She's a sound technician for the school. We are making college visits for her. She's not sure where she wants to go. We did make a visit at that school up north. Let me assure you, folks, they're going to have to come up with a lot of money if she's going to go there. Yeah. She's also applied to USC. She really wants to go to the University of Chicago. She's looking at Cincinnati and Akron. So we'll see what comes of that. But that's my family. Now, the interim process. If you do one thing for me. Everybody take a nice big deep breath and let it out. All right, people, let's just relax, okay? Let's relax. I want you to know that I come here to serve as your pastor. The main focus of what I do is to be a pastor, to lead in worship, and to preach, and to teach, and to visit the sick and the shut-in. 75%, the main thing I do is to be a pastor here with Sigrid, helping her and supporting her and working with the ministries of this congregation. 25% of that time, a quarter of the time, is spent on the interim process. So we need to all sort of get that in our head that I will be here to be your pastor, to preach and to teach and do all the things that normal pastors do, though I've never met, I don't know if you've ever met a normal pastor. We're not normal. But there will be, because we do have to do this interim process, there will be time devoted to that and working with committees to get that set up. So just so you know that. One of the things that the interim process allows us to do is to be the Roman god Janus, right? Janus is the two-faced god, always one face looking back to the past, one face always looking out to the future. So, and that's where we get, the name of the month, January. As it begins the year, we're looking to the new year and the new opportunities. So part of what we're going to do is talk about your history. I want to know about your history. I want to know what's taken place here in Westerville, what your strengths are, what your challenges have been, where you see your ministry being the most effective. And we're going to look forward into the new year, into this process, to figure out where God is calling the Westerville Church to. What ministries are there going to be? When you have an interim process, though, I will say, from what I understand, there's about 3 reactions that you can get. First, let's just get our new pastor as quickly as possible. Jeff's an old Methodist, so we have to give him a little bit of lax there. Second, okay, we can tolerate this time, but let's not make it too long, okay? We'll do some things, but let's not prolong this. Let's move as quickly through it as we can. And finally, third, folks can look at it as a time of opportunities for growth, for discernment, for introspection. Who are we? Who is our neighbor? What is our community that we sit in? How can we serve them? What are the things that we see are needed in the Westerville community? And do we have the gifts and skills to make that happen? This is a time of opportunity. So, to talk a little bit about through that. First, the first one, get our new pastor as quickly as possible. That tends to make the church ministry just about the pastor. We hire the pastor to come and do ministry to us or for us. The laity are served with a pastor. And be sure, we serve the laity. That's true. But you don't call clergy, you don't hire them, you don't employ them to do ministry to you. We come to help guide and to shape and to frame that, but to do ministry with you, to call you into ministry. When I was in the Methodist church, and we were talking about administration of the church, because all clergy have to do some administration things. We do administration. So part of that, what we do is we administer, right? But really what we do is add ministers. We are here to add ministers to the body of Christ. You all have a ministry. You all vowed to have a ministry in your baptismal vows. We all have a ministry to grow into and to live into and to exercise on behalf of the church. So in that first thing, and it's extreme, and I'm talking about extreme, that idea that we just need to get the next pastor, that tends to see the pastor as somebody we hire to do ministry on our behalf. And that's not where a real healthy congregation needs to be. We need to do ministry together, to challenge one another, to shape and to grow together. One of the things I had a negative reaction in the Methodist Church to is when they ordain folks in that denomination, they talk about the ordination being a time where people are set apart for ministry. And I don't think that's what I was ordained to be set apart. I believe I was ordained, I was called as one among. I don't like to use the terminology of being set apart, but being called as one among, who might lead, who might guide, who might shape. But ultimately, the ministry that the Westerville Community Church has is the ministry of the people who come here week after week, who participate in all the activities, who participate in the mission projects and the giving and whatever it is. That's all of us together. If you're just looking for the next pastor, then you're hiring somebody just to come and do it for you. And we have to do it together. Second, in its extreme, we tolerate this time but not for long. The church is a fellowship, and the pastor is a key part of the fellowship. The church's ministry has some room for the laity, but it's really still just about the pastor. We'll give you some leeway until we find the next person, but let's not make it prolonged. There's a little bit of balance there, but it's not as much as it would be in a growing and healthy congregation. And so finally, the third one is this time of opportunity and growth. The laity is an integral part of the work of the church. And I only like to use the word power, but there is power and leadership sharing across the board. In the process, in the long run, will strengthen the church to the ministry to which God calls it. So something we do together. Nobody's going to do it for you. We're going to, if it happens, it's going to be us doing it together. And it's going to take some time. And I know it's a little trepidatious, but I think really this third way is the way we need to go for a healthy start for the next phase of the ministry here at Westerville Community Church. So the interim process looks like this. There are 5 developmental tasks: history, mission, leadership, connections, and future. So history. As I said before, I want to hear about your history, and we want to celebrate that history. We want to understand that history as who it forms us and frames us to be, so that we can then move beyond that history into the future God's calling us to be a part of. One of the biggest things we do in the interim process is to talk about the mission of the church. What is our calling here? What is our, the question is, if the Westerville church didn't exist, would anybody miss it? And if they would, why? What is it that we do here? What is it that you do? What ministries do you affect that really have a meaning and a purpose and serve people outside the walls of this church? So discerning who we are, who God's calling us to be, who our neighbors are, and then what do we think God would be served by if we would do it? I always ask the question this time, if money and leadership and personnel and time and space, none of that were any objects, what would you like to do in ministry? What would you like to do? Start with the big things. Don't put any restrictions on. Well, we don't have the people who do that, or we don't have enough money to do that. We don't have the space to do that. Let's forget about all that. Let's think about what could we do here in Westerville that would have a meaning and impact on the people here, and go from there. Find out what God's calling us to be and do. It's a perfect time during the interim to assess the leadership structure of the church. I know one of the reasons that I'm here is because Phil and I had a wonderful conversation this last summer. I was driving to my parents' home, and he was talking about they were doing surveys of churches of like sizes, and how did we govern ourselves, and how did we do committees, and how did we do terms of offices and all that stuff. It's a perfect time to look at leadership. Is it serving its purpose? Is it nimble and responsive? Does it allow for us to do the most ministry with the least amount of having to sit in a committee meeting? Somebody got that. Thank you. So it's not that committees are bad. It's not that the structure the church has been bad. It's just maybe it has served its time. And perhaps, again, what can we think of new? I always used a guy at Trinity. He was a moderator. His son Ryan was about 40 years old. Wonderful guy, fireman in town, wonderful person. And Trinity had this beautiful dome in the top of it. And it was a beautiful thing. And I always wanted to, sort of paint fat, chubby little cherubs up there, right? And I knew I could ask him. I would ask him, Ryan, to set up a scaffold and come and paint that dome. And he would say yes in a heartbeat. But ask him to serve on a committee for 3 years? Not going to happen. Not going to happen. We have to realize in this day and age, time is just as much a commodity we have as is our money and our goods and our services. So is the leadership structure, is it functioning nimble and responsive enough to meet the needs of the congregation? And can it be flexible enough when things happen to, maybe we'll do it a different way? One of the things that I want to covenant with you and me in this interim process is we will never say the 7 words that killed the church. Do you know the 7 words that killed the church? We've never done it that way before. I'm getting permission from your leadership. If anybody here says that, I'm going to call you on it. And if I say it, hopefully I don't, but you can call me. But let's call one another on that. Let's not think of those type of things. Yeah, well, you could say, well, that's interesting. That seems different, but how would it work? And we can question things. There's nothing wrong with that. Everything should be on the board in the interim process. And you've been doing a lot of that. I read your last 3-year strategic plan. You've done a lot of that work. I think that ran out in 2019, right? So it's time again. And then it's a perfect time to talk about connections with the wider church and how do we fit into the overall UCC structure? What do we do and how do we minister with other churches in the association? How do we partner with them to do things? How do we enter partnerships with the conference to do things or to host things or to sponsor things? How do we partner with we have a very lively German partnership here. But connections, solidifying those connections and opening those connections to make sure, again, that they're still viable and still things that have meaning and bring purpose to those who are involved in that. And then what other connections could there be? What other churches could we get together and do something with? Or, it's in a day and age where cooperation is key. We can't think of ourselves as an island unto ourselves. So in this time of introspection and thinking about where God is calling the Westerville Church, it's also a perfect time to talk about who else can we partner with to do some of these things that we have big pictures for. And finally, future. We're actually going to talk about the future and what it brings and making a plan then after we've done this mission work, after we've done all this introspection and tried to figure out who we are and living up to our mission statement and our value statement, how then do we put flesh on that? How do we make that happen? And in that process, what you do is if this then becomes the ministry and mission of the congregation, then you want a staff for that. You want somebody as a leader who has those gifts and skills. And so along the way, we're still working on the church profile. We're still working on the wants and needs we see in our next clergy person who's going to serve here. And how is that going to fit into this new calling we feel that God is calling us into? So that's all wrapped up in there so that when we get to that future part, we have an idea of where we think God is calling this church, and then who do we think through the search process has the gifts and skills to help us with that. So those are the 5 developmental tasks that happen throughout the interim time. An effective and good and healthy interim time can take at minimum a year. Sometimes it can take 18 months. But again, remember, my biggest portion of what I do is to be your pastor, 75% of my time. To preach and teach and do all the things that need to happen around here in ministry with you as we seek to figure out who God is calling us to be in our next iteration. All right. Q&A. Who has questions? Good. Oh, darn. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, the boss said, your wife says.
I'm sorry. What do you enjoy most about the ministry?
The people, meeting the people. I love teaching Bible study and being interactive. And again, I don't teach it from a perspective that I know everything. In fact, I often say to folks that at the end of a sermon, I kind of always want to say, but what do I know? So I don't come from a standpoint of I'm going to teach you about it. So I learn more when I'm teaching Bible study from folks and getting that. So interacting with folks is one of the greatest joys of ministry for me.
Hi, Mike Kennedy. I was just going to ask you, what do you think a pastor's role in resolving conflicts within the church community is?
Well, I think sometimes we are a society that doesn't listen well, right? We have all these blaring talking heads on newscasts or in blogs or on YouTube. I don't think we listen well, and I think the pastor's role can really be that person that tries to honor every voice that's at the table. So I specifically, when I have a meeting, if I notice somebody hasn't said anything, I will purposely say to that person, we haven't heard your perspective, but So I think when you have some conflict and some that needs some resolution, hearing from all sides, hearing from everybody's voice, trying to get some input, and being civil to one another. I mean, we have to agree to that. We know that we're all not going to agree on everything, but what can we live with? And treating one another civilly and hearing from all the voices is the way to go about that, from my perspective. There's a question up here, too.
Thank you. What prompted you to be interested in this interim position?
I've been in the parish setting for 25 years. And I would say after 25 years, you can get a little burnout, okay, because the same thing over and over and over and over again. So what excites me about this is that this is a whole different thing. And helping a church, a congregation sort of shepherd through that bit of thinking of who they are just seems really fulfilling to me and very exciting. That I'm not just here to write a mission statement for you. I'm not just here for you to think for 2 months and then we've got a profile and we're going to pastor, but really digging in deep. And I just think that's going to be so exciting to do.
Churches can be seen as a business. What do you see the pastor's role in fundraising and helping the church get the funding to run that business?
Well, to be honest, and I got nothing to do but be honest with you, my last congregation sort of saw their senior minister as a CEO, and that didn't set well with me. That was one of our issues. Okay, I have the heart of a pastor. I have the heart and the soul of a pastor. I am not a CEO. I think there's many things in the business community that we can learn, and we should learn, and we can adapt. But I have some sort of challenges when a church is run as a business. So I just want to say that up front. But the senior minister, the lead pastor, however you term that, is the front person for that body, that fellowship, that community. So being that person out in the community, knowing other community leaders, going to city councils and going to breakfasts with the Optimist or whatever, all kinds of ways that person should integrate themselves into the community so that they become a part, they become the face of the organization. And then when there's things like stewardship campaigns, capital campaigns, again, not just knowing folks outside the community, but being very intentional of getting to know folks in the community, in the church membership, to be that face of the congregation. I knew there was something.
I'm right here.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. Could you describe your commitment to your own personal spiritual development?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I said, I'm a member of the Order of St. Luke, and so I write articles. I've published for the Journal of Sacramental Life on issues around the Lord's table, and that's very fulfilling. And I'm always looking for the next book to have as a book club. I'm always I teach for the Northeast Ohio School of Ministry, so I'm teaching actually in winter and spring this next year. It's all online, so I can do it from here. I don't have to go anywhere. I'm teaching New Testament 1 and New Testament 2. And I find the practice of me, again, researching all of that and coming up with a plan of action to teach those courses, again, getting a lot of interaction from the students and learning from them. It's very spiritually fulfilling. I covenant with my brothers and sisters in the Order of St. Luke to pray the daily office, so pray every morning for the 800 members and the world. But we also, when we have our monthly meetings, we get together and we have a worship service. We always have communion. We always have a time of spiritual development. The order has retreats every year in October. They have a week-long retreat that I tend to go to. They also have a spring council meeting where we worship it's at St. Paul of the Cross Seminary Monastery in Pittsburgh, and so we worship there with the brothers 3 or 4 times a day. So those are all very spiritually fulfilling for me. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, don't you think a bow tie is kind of
Stop.
pretentious?
No. Okay. Sorry. um, you're wearing a bow tie too.
So many things I could say right now that I'm not going to.
Yeah.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Hi. I'm Anna. I'm Pastor Sigrid's daughter.
Okay.
So at WCUCC, we have a really prominent youth, and we have a very nice youth program. And although we do have a youth minister, what do you think the senior pastor's role is as concerned to the involvement of youth?
Yeah, I think I loved going to the youth activities. I loved talking with the kids. I loved, I loved being around them for the energy that they bring to things, and doing all I can from my position to make sure that, because they did a lot of fundraising, because they took on a mission trip every year, but to make sure that those were well organized and to work with the youth pastor, because we had a youth minister too, to make sure those are all set and folks know about them, and to encourage folks to give to that, encourage folks. We also got 5-gallon buckets that we sent with everyone, and they made a list of things they wanted. So the cookies or whatever they got those on Wednesday during the middle of the week. So making sure that the folks who went off on mission trips knew that we were still thinking about them. We had these things, comforts from home, we called them. But yeah, just being around and supporting, and perhaps if the youth minister wanted me to help out in any specific thing or teach something specific or come in and talk about some issue, or in Wadsworth, unfortunately, we've had a couple suicides, and to be a part of that and to do some counseling, that's all part of it. Thank you for that question, Anna.
How do you envision splitting your time between Wadsworth and Westerville?
Good question. My in-laws, my wife's parents, live in Waldo, Ohio. I've never had a bologna sandwich at the GNR. I'm just going to say, we go there and we get pizza. I don't know what that's about. If you know the little burg of Norton, just south of there, there's a sporting goods store there, hunting, fishing, archery supplies. That's my father-in-law's store. So I'm going to bed down with them during the week. I anticipate coming in Saturday night, so I could be here on Sundays, working here through Thursday afternoon. Hope to go home in time for my daughter to be home from school, and spend Thursday night, Friday, Saturday with them, and come back Saturday. That's kind of the rhythm of my life, I think. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about the training that you received to be an interim?
Yeah, it was a 3-day training event at Camp Christian in Marysville, Ohio. And it was a joint Disciples of Christ and United Church of Christ event with folks who have been doing interim ministry for many, many years. And Nairi Karjian, our general minister of the Living Water Association, was also one of the presenters, and they had other folks come in and out who had been in interim ministry and talk about their experiences. But it was very extensive, down from writing a covenant, getting through the developmental tasks, how to deal with conflict. We talked about some models that might work. One of the ones I gravitate to is appreciative inquiry, which I think is very helpful. So we learned that model, and I think it was a very extensive 3 days. It was wonderful, and just folks who had these experiences and were doing interim ministries, and just learned as much during mealtime and after presentation time as I did in the presentations. But we got all the slideshows, we got all the PowerPoint stuff, we got handouts galore. So it was a very good time. Enjoyed it immensely. Thank you.
Most of us think of an interim going to a church with one pastor.
Yeah.
Was there anything in the training that dealt with if there's already another pastor at the church?
Well, just don't step on her toes. There wasn't anything specific about that. But, Sigrid and I have had several conversations. We've been friends for 10 years or more. And I've already told her that if I overstep, she is charged to tell me that. Again, we've talked about this and we agree. I'm not hung up on titles. One of my friends said, well, this is an associate position. You've been a senior for 15 years. I don't think this is a step back. I don't think this is anything less than I've been doing in my ministry so far. It's different. And then again, that's what excites me because it's different. We'll probably have to have some talks, and we'll probably have some times where we're going to step on each other's toes. It's just natural. And we'll work those out. And one of the things that also I would like to see as a part of this is, regular checkups with leadership for me. Is this what you envisioning what it's going to be? What have you been hearing from the congregation? They've got some questions about this. How can we address that? I think it's very important to have a lot of meetings with the leadership and Sigrid. So thank you. Yes, sir.
Dan, how do you integrate your musical talents into your ministry?
Yeah, I've never sung my sermon. I have sung in choir. I've directed church choir before too. Yeah. I try to in some ways I try to keep that separate. I mean, I do call on my gifts and skills as a musician to be in a pulpit like this. If you test me, I'm really an introvert. But having been on the stage and played a part, I'm comfortable being in front of people. So music has helped me in that. But professionally, as I sing, the last opera I did in Cleveland went from first rehearsal to last performance 16 days. And the week of, when I knew it was going to be every night, I just took a week's vacation because I don't want anybody in the congregation to complain that I'm doing stuff on my own personal time when they're paying me to be their pastor. So I've kind of reconciled within myself that when I feel like something is taking me away from church work, then I'm going to account for that as vacation time. So I never try to cross that line. I want to keep those separate. When I'm your pastor, and I'm going to do pastoral things. The hardest thing I do when I plan worship is pick the hymns. I can do everything else in the service, and I always leave the hymns to last because they have to be relevant to the theme. They have to be singable. And I've been known, if they're not, to even write hymns. So I do integrate it quite a bit, but I don't sing every Sunday. And if you need a tenor in the choir, I guess I could help out. Right? Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
I was looking over the churches of the UCC you've been affiliated with.
Yes.
And I was Googling, I'll admit that. Have any of those churches been ONA?
Trinity United Church of Christ in Wadsworth, Ohio. When I arrived there, they were on the ONA list. When you went to the website for ONA and you clicked, you found Trinity, it said it was ONA. But I would say about 5 or 6 years later, for some reason I was checking, and we weren't listed anymore. Okay, so I called up and I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, we don't have you anywhere having had a covenant statement." So the story that was pieced together for Trinity Church was a former pastor who was there, served that church for 35 years, started in 1957, still living. He lives in Delaware. Had a daughter who was gay, and he wanted her to be as accepted and fully integrated in the life of that congregation as she could be in any other circumstance. So this pastor laid a lot of groundwork, and I even called him when we found out we weren't on the list. I'm like, "Well, how did you ever become ONA before?" And he said, "Well, we never voted on it. We came to a consensus that we're not in charge of membership. That's, if God places somebody in our midst who wants to be part of our fellowship, we don't get to choose that. They become a member." So they dealt with it that way. So I called the national office of it, said, "This is our history. Nobody can find a time when we voted on it, but they all said it was the leadership of the congregation brought it through consensus, and everybody agreed that we were going to be this loving, open community that doesn't deny membership on any basis." And I brought somebody down from the national office, sat with us, talked to people around the table, and he basically said, if you feel you're O&A, then you're O&A. So all we had to do was write a new covenant statement, which we, by consensus, approved at the next annual meeting of the congregation, and then we were simply put back on the list. I will say, though, that in the midst of that process, somebody said, you know, it's fine, because everybody at the church believed they were O&A. They couldn't believe they weren't. And somebody said, well, it's all fine and dandy, we can do that, but we're not going to put a rainbow flag in the front of our congregation. Across the front of that congregation is a rainbow flag. And here's the reason why. Well, I don't know why. I wasn't there when they put it up. But if it's a flag, if it's a rainbow strip at the bottom of the board out there that tells about the church, if it's just a rainbow sticker, whatever, it lets folks know that this is a safe place, a non-judgmental, safe place to be. So we don't have to fly the flag, I agree. But when you get the designation of being O&A, there should be some way, visually from the outside, for folks to know that that's a safe place to come to. However that works out, but there should be some recognition of that. Nope. Phil's had so many questions already.
They don't consider themselves a candidate for the settled pastor role. You know, we've agreed that this is a designated interim, which means you can be considered for the associate pastor, a settled pastor role. Is there how would an interim pastor behave differently as a candidate for that role versus the one who isn't considered a candidate for the role?
Well, in general, and we've talked about this in your home, Phil.
I want everyone else to know the answer too.
And I'll translate tonight. The interim minister who comes in and seeks to try to dig deep and get you to realize who you are and where God's calling you can't be afraid to tick people off. Okay? Now, someone who's going to be designated might want to be considered for that, maybe thinks about that a little bit more than just a strict interim. You know, even that you're having an interim process is probably going to make a few folks upset. It's just the nature of what it is. But I wanted to be clear, and I was clear with Phil when we talked. I want to be clear with you that I am not here in the interim process to write a job description that I will then take because it's perfect for me because I wrote it. I don't want that for you. I don't want to be, if we get along and we like each other and it's all great. Jeff asked this at the first interview. What if happens in March and April? We just like you and we want to keep you. I said, well, I'm gonna push against that because we really need to do the interim process first of all, and it's just a time in which we have to be careful. I do not want to be the convenient candidate because I'm here. I want to be the right candidate if this is right for you, if it's right for me.
When you went through the training, you said basically the last 3 years you found out they need an interim. And then when you went through the training, did you go, oh.
The first night, I thought if I would have known half of this, I would still be at Baptist Church. Just because I would have been more pointed at doing some of the interim stuff underneath the radar because it's important work to do. So yeah, I had a big realization. I went, oh, okay. So yeah, I wish I would have had it. And the conference minister, David Long Higgins, and I talked when I told him I was thinking about doing the interim training. He's like, you know, it's such good just ministry training, not even interim ministry training, but it's very good ministry training. And I agree with him 100%. It was great training, and I'm glad I had it.
Hello? Hello? Okay, this this kind of concludes the big session. I'm going to ask Dan if he might station himself out by the door, and as people leave, just like Sunday, shake, press the flesh. So if you'd like to.
Do I have to remember names?
Yeah, they'll.
That's next week. I'll remember names. If you have your name and tag on it, I will remember your name every Sunday.
And I'll ask. I think it's on. It sounds like it. No. Okay, I will let non-council members exit. 1 minute. We'll have non-council members exit and say goodbye to Dan, and I'll ask the council members to hang around after the gathering is done. Thank you, Dan. It was very nicely done. Thank you. Now we'll have our prayer, and then we'll light.
Thank you, Dan, for your honesty, and that we all are aware now of what hopefully might happen. And thank you, especially to you and to Phil for organizing this tonight. So thank you. We pray together. Gracious God, thank you for this evening. Thank you for learning more about what this interim process is all about. It's like having a mirror in front of us, looking at it, looking at the past, and looking at the future, and knowing that you have both in your hands. We pray especially that you know what is best for us, for all of us, for Westerville Community United Church of Christ, for Dan and the leadership. We trust in your decision, and we trust because you have carried us for the last 35 plus years, that you will guide us and that you will be at the center of who we are at Westerville Community United Church of Christ. And we lay ourselves into your hands. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.